Some debts are never forgotten, no matter how deep you bury them. No matter how many generations pass, the forest remembers, and it calls back what was taken. The village of Uka lay under a sky too heavy to hold stars. The clouds hung low, as if waiting to smother the rooftops, to press the breath from the lungs of those beneath them. No wind stirred the thatched eaves. No dogs barked. Even the goats huddled silent in their pens, wide-eyed and trembling. Inside their huts, the people of Uka murmured old songs sung without melody, voices roughened by fear and smoke. They daubed black lines of ash across their faces and wrists. They lit bowls of oil mixed with crushed bones, the stench thick and bitter in their throats. Charms dangled from every window and doorframe, teeth strung on twine, feathers dipped in goat's blood, and iron shards hammered into crude shapes meant to ward off spirits. But the air inside was still cold, and the silence outside was colder. There were no drums, no dances, no fires burned in the village square. And at the edge of it all, where the last hut leaned crooked beneath the weight of an ancient fig tree, Adanna stood alone. Her fingers were pale where they gripped the silver flute tied at her hip. Her breath left her lips in slow, careful clouds, as if breathing too hard might shatter something fragile in the air. Behind her, Mama Inki whispered old words under her breath, tracing circles in the dust with a finger stained red from crushed berries and blood. A charm of woven grass and bone swung from her neck, tapping lightly against her chest in time with her heartbeat. Too fast. She did not look at Adanna. She did not look at Chima. But they both felt her gaze, like weight pressing between their shoulder blades. Chima stood with his arms at his sides. The charm bracelet Mama Inki had tied there bit into his skin with every pulse of his heart. He didn't remember when he'd started trembling. He only noticed it now, when he tried to speak, and couldn't. The forest loomed before them. Its edge was not marked by any fence or wall. It did not need to be. The trees closest to the village were twisted, roots gnarled and exposed, their bark flaked away to reveal pale flesh beneath, like scars, and beyond them, only shadow. A whisper rode the mist, slipping between the huts and winding around bare ankles. Not a word, not yet, just a knowing, a call. Adanna took the first step forward. The dry grass crackled under her heel. Then Emeka followed, his spear glinting dully, tip angled low. Chima was last. Behind them, the village of Uka waited, silent, breathless. If they returned, they would not return the same. And if they did not, the forest would keep them, like it kept everything else. The first step into the forest was like stepping beneath deep water. The air thickened, sound dulled. The world behind them, the village, the sky, even the wind, seemed to fade away. The ground was soft, spongy beneath their feet, and each footfall left behind a shallow impression that slowly filled with black water. Adanna walked ahead, one hand resting lightly on the silver flute at her waist, her fingers tapping a slow, steady rhythm against the cool metal. She kept her eyes low, watching where the roots jutted up like broken bones, where the vines twisted like veins under thin skin. She did not look back. Behind her, Chima followed. Every breath he took was an effort, dragged in slow through tight lungs. The charm around his wrist pulsed faintly, whether from his heartbeat or something else. He couldn't tell anymore. He could feel the damp creeping into his bones, not like cold, but like rot, as if something inside him was beginning to soften and decay. Emeka brought up the rear. His spear was ready in his hand, though he held it low, not as a threat, but as if to steady himself. The blade at its tip caught no light. There was none to catch, but it seemed to drink in the shadow all the same. His eyes darted constantly, side to side, reading the forest like a tracker reading prints in the dirt. But here, there were no tracks, only scars. Tree trunks split by lightning long ago, holes bored deep into bark where something had gnawed its way in or out. And above them, a ceiling of twisted branches so dense they strangled what little light remained. There were no birds, no insects, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, only their breath, and something else, a whisper. At first, it seemed to be the wind, thin, faint, slipping between the trees like a silk thread. But it wasn't wind. It had weight, words, not clear, not yet, but close enough to feel them on your skin. Chima stopped walking. The others did not notice at first. He stood still in the path, his hands flexing at his sides as if they had begun to cramp. "Did you hear that?" His voice was thin, dry. Adanna stopped. She didn't turn. She didn't want to. Emeka's answer was flat. "We're not listening to that." But it was there, whispering, growing louder with each step they took. They found the body just before midday. Or maybe it found them. It hung from a low branch, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. At first, it looked like an animal carcass, skinned and hung to cure. But as they drew closer, they saw the shape of hands, feet, the curve of a jaw, teeth exposed in a rictus grin stretched far too wide. The skin had been flayed away, peeled back with such precision that it left behind only gleaming muscle, tendons slick and glistening as if still wet. There was no blood. Not anymore. Whatever had been inside had long since drained away, leaving something that was waiting. Adanna covered her mouth with her hand. The bile rose thick in her throat, but she forced it down. Emeka didn't speak at first. His face was carved from stone, but his grip tightened on the spear shaft until his knuckles cracked. "It's one of ours," he said at last, his voice low, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. "A hunter." Chima stepped closer, his breath shallow. There was something carved into the bark of the tree where the body hung. Circles inside circles. Spirals turning endlessly in on themselves. And beneath them, carved deep in a single line, D-E-B-T. The word seemed fresh, as if someone had carved it just moments before they arrived. Adanna swallowed hard. She reached out slowly, her fingers hovering just above the bark. They trembled before she drew them back. Mama Inki moved past them all. She knelt at the base of the tree, her old hands tracing the spirals with a familiarity that made Adanna's stomach twist. "This is a warning," Mama Inki said. Her voice was not surprised, not afraid, resigned. "They want us to know we are seen." Emeka slid his knife free. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for a sign. With one swift motion, he cut his palm open. The blood welled bright and hot. He smeared it across the spirals, across the word, across the scarred flesh of the tree. "For safe passage," he murmured. The forest did not answer, but the wind changed. It carried with it a scent that was sweet at first, like ripe fruit, and then rotting meat. No one spoke after that. They simply moved on, because there was nowhere else to go. They moved deeper. The path, if it could be called that, narrowed to little more than a dark vein threading its way through dense undergrowth. The roots thickened here, knotting over each other in tangled mounds, rising out of the ground like ancient bones. Some of them still bled. Sticky sap oozed from cracks in the bark, dark and glistening, and the air was thick with its sickly sweet scent. At times, the ground pulsed beneath their feet, slow, steady, like a heartbeat. Once, Adanna stumbled and caught herself against one of the larger roots. It was warm, and it moved. Chima said nothing, but his breathing was getting faster, sharper. The whispers were louder now, no longer like the wind, but like voices, soft, insistent. They called names, sometimes Adanna's, sometimes Emeka's, but more often, Chima. It was said gently, lovingly, and wrong. He stopped walking. The others didn't notice at first. He stood there, his shoulders rigid, his head tilted just slightly to the side, as if listening for something far away. Then he spoke, or tried to. "Mama?" His voice cracked on the word. His throat worked, swallowing hard, but the sound came again, from behind him, from beneath him. "My son," the voice crooned, soft as breath. "You've come back to me." Adanna turned. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Chima's face had gone pale. His eyes were wide and glassy, reflecting nothing but shadow. She lunged forward, grabbing his wrist with both hands. "Don't listen," she hissed. But it was already too late. The earth beneath Chima cracked, a thin hairline fracture at first, then wider and wider. A pale hand shot up from the darkness below, fingers like roots, long and thin, nails sharp as splinters. They closed around Chima's ankle and pulled. The ground yawned open, a shallow grave, and it wanted him back. It took all of them, Adanna pulling at his arms, Emeka bracing her with his spear shaft wedged under Chima's chest to drag him free. The hand crumbled as they tore him loose. Dust, ash, nothing left. They lay panting on the ground, the air around them thick with the stench of burned wood and old blood. Then they saw it, a hollow in the earth where Chima had stood, a shallow pit. Inside it lay bones, not white, but blackened, charred, as if they'd been burned alive and then left to rot. Among the bones was something small, delicate, a necklace. Chima crawled toward it on his hands and knees, his fingers trembling as he lifted it from the ash. The leather was cracked, brittle, but the beadwork was unmistakable. "It's his," Chima whispered. His throat was raw, his voice more breath than sound. "My father's." Mama Inki was silent for a long time. Then she exhaled, not a sigh, more like something leaving her. "This is where he died," she said. Her hand hovered over the grave, as if feeling for heat that was no longer there. Her face, for the first time, looked old, not aged by time, but by weight. Emeka knelt beside her, his fingers pressing into the ash. He rubbed it between his fingers, staring down at it with the expression of a man who has long since run out of prayers. "I was there," he said quietly. "We thought we were bargaining for life." He looked up at Chima. But he was bargaining with death. Chima's head snapped toward him. His eyes burned, his teeth bared. "You let him do it." Emeka didn't flinch. "I ran," he said. His voice was flat, empty. "And now I run no more." The silence between them was thick. It wrapped around their throats, heavy and suffocating. Adanna stood, brushing ash from her palms, her eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They all knew what waited, and they kept walking, because there was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. They found it at dusk, when the last light died behind them, and the shadows grew too thick to tell earth from sky, when the air turned colder and breathing felt like swallowing glass. The gate. Two ancient trees, their trunks twisted together in a lover's embrace, or a strangler's grip. Where their bark touched, it had split open, fusing flesh to flesh. Not bark anymore, but skin. The pale gleam of sinew stretched tight, veins, dark and sluggish, pulsing beneath a translucent surface. Adanna stopped first. The silver flute at her waist seemed heavier now, dragging at her hip, as though it too sensed the weight of what lay before them. She stood motionless, her eyes wide, catching every grotesque detail. Mama Inki's breathing was shallow. Each exhale trembled in her throat. Her old fingers traced symbols in the air, wards, blessings, maybe curses. But her eyes were fixed on the gate, and they were afraid. "This is it," Mama Inki said softly. Her voice wasn't much more than a breath. "The gate of whispers." The words fell like stones into water, soft, but sending ripples out into the world, into the trees, into the soil. No one steps through unchanged. Chima stepped closer, closer than either of them wanted him to. He reached out a hand, and before Adanna could stop him, his fingers touched the bone arch that framed the opening between the trees. It was cold, so cold, it burned. The gate shuddered, not like wood under pressure, but like lungs inhaling after too long without breath. A sound slid free from the dark space beyond, long, slow, and wet, like something being exhaled, or something being born. The opening between the trees widened. The bone and sinew stretched with a sickening creak. A breath, heavy and old, washed over them. It smelled of damp earth and rotting teeth. Chima's hand dropped back to his side, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "It's open," he said. But it wasn't his voice anymore, not entirely. From the darkness beyond the gate, something moved, a shape, large, low to the ground. It padded forward on silent feet, emerging into the half-light that clung desperately to the world outside. Ajandu, the hound of the dead. Its fur was slick, wet, matted with something that glistened red-black in the gloom. Its body was stretched too long, its legs too thin to support its mass. Its mouth hung slightly open, showing teeth that were yellowed and cracked, some broken off at the root. But it was the eyes, or where the eyes should have been, that held them still. Empty holes, gouged deep, yet they watched. They always watched. The hound sniffed the air once, then it sat, quiet, waiting. "It's not here to attack," Emeka said quietly, his voice no more than a breath. "It's here to witness." Mama Inki spat into the dirt. "Or to collect," she said, her voice low and bitter. "What's left of us when we fail." The hound blinked slowly, or maybe it didn't, and the darkness behind it pulsed, steady and patient, like the beating of a second heart. They stood there a long time, waiting for courage, and when they found none, they walked forward anyway. Past the gate, the forest changed. Or perhaps it was no longer forest at all. The trees thinned out, though their roots spread wide and knotted beneath every step. Stone pillars jutted from the earth at angles that made no sense, some leaning against one another, others cracked and broken as if gnawed through by enormous teeth. Water pooled between them. Still. Black. Reflecting nothing. The silence deepened here. It was not the hush of emptiness, but the pressing weight of things unsaid. The kind of silence that knows your name. Adanna's footsteps slowed as they entered the clearing. She could feel it now. The difference in the air. Thin. Cold. Like breathing smoke that wasn't there. Chima moved beside her. Or rather, something wearing Chima's shape. He walked differently now. Not heavy, but deliberate. As if measuring each step, weighing the cost of every movement. Emeka followed last, his eyes sweeping the space like a man looking for escape routes he already knows don't exist. He had stopped holding his spear at the ready. Now, it hung loose at his side, like he knew it wouldn't matter. They stopped at the center of the clearing. A broken stone altar stood there, half sunk into the ground. On its surface, old stains blackened the gray stone. Something long dried, but never washed away. Emeka was the first to speak. He didn't look at them as he did. His voice was hollow, flat. I watched them die. Adanna's grip tightened on her flute. She did not ask who he meant. She already knew. One by one, Emeka said. He knelt at the edge of the altar, tracing the grooves carved deep into its face. Symbols, spirals, the same ones carved on the tree where they'd found the hunter. He closed his eyes. I watched his father kneel. Chima said nothing, but his jaw clenched. The muscles there twitched, a ripple under his skin that didn't stop. Emeka continued. He begged her for life. His fingers tightened on the stone. For rain, for crops, for the village. He opened his eyes and looked directly at Chima, and he promised her something in return. The wind moved then, a small thing, a shift, but it carried the weight of old things awakening. Chima's voice was a rasp, dry and cracked. Me. It wasn't a question. It was a fact he had known, and tried not to. Mama Inki's face was unreadable. Her hands moved over the beads around her neck, but she said nothing. Not yet. Chima stepped forward, his feet dragging in the dirt. You were there, he said to Emeka. His tone was flat, but his eyes blazed. You let him do it. Emeka met his gaze and nodded. I ran. The word hung in the air, heavier than any weapon. And I run no more. For a long moment, they stared at one another. Two men bound by betrayal, by debts that were never theirs to pay. Adanna broke the silence. We don't have time for this, she said, but her voice shook, because she knew time was no longer something they had. As they moved on, the darkness deepened again. It wasn't nightfall. It wasn't shadow. It was something thicker, a presence. The trees thinned out further until there were only pillars, stone and bone, some carved with faces half-finished, mouths open in screams that had never ended. They came to another clearing, and Adanna stopped. Her hand lifted slowly, untangling the silver flute from her belt. The metal was cold, colder than it should have been. Her fingers hesitated at first, but then she raised it to her lips. The first note was soft, a lullaby, one her mother had sung to her when she was a child, before. The melody drifted through the air, delicate, beautiful, in a way that felt wrong here, like singing to a grave. The shadows moved. They leaned in. Emeka stiffened, his spear rising again. But Mama Inki lifted a hand to stop him. Let it be, she whispered. And then Adanna saw them. Figures, not of flesh, but of memory. Inki, her sister, standing beneath the old fig tree where they used to play. But her eyes were wrong, black, hollow, bleeding. Her mouth worked, but no sound came. Their mother stood nearby, bent over a basin, washing clothes that were soaked red. No matter how she scrubbed, the color did not fade. The music didn't protect them. It didn't hold the darkness back. It revealed it. And what it revealed was everything they had lost, and everything they could still lose. Adanna lowered the flute slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The figures faded, but the sense of their presence remained, as if they had only stepped aside for a moment, and would return soon, very soon. The path narrowed again, or perhaps they had narrowed, drawn tight together by things unseen, herded forward like animals toward slaughter. They came to a hollow in the earth, a place where even the stones seemed to shrink back, as if unwilling to touch the soil. The ground here was cracked and dry despite the damp air. White veins of something brittle ran through the dirt like bones too close to the surface. Chima stumbled. His foot caught on nothing. His breath hitched, sharp and ragged. Adanna turned. He was on his knees, his hands pressed deep into the soil, fingers clawing furrows as if trying to hold on. "Chima?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. His shoulders shook once, then again, harder. Then his back arched, a violent jerk that tore a cry from his throat. But it wasn't just pain. It was wrong. The sound of something splitting apart. Adanna dropped to his side. Her hands hovered over him, not knowing where to touch, afraid to touch. Chima's skin was changing. Lines dark as ink ran beneath it, spreading like roots under glass. Veins, but wrong. Thicker. Twisting. His breath came in gasps now, each one dragging blood from his nose, from his mouth. His teeth. She could see them lengthening, sharpening. Mama Inki's voice cut through the air then. A chant. Old words, brittle with age. Her fingers traced symbols in the air, faster now, desperate. But it wasn't enough. Chima's fingernails split and cracked, dark claws pushing through. His arms shook violently as he tried to hold himself upright. "I'm not," he rasped. His voice cracked again. "Me." Blood welled at the corners of his eyes. Tears, thick and black, ran down his cheeks in slow rivulets. Adanna reached for her flute, but what could it do? What song could fix this? Chima's body convulsed once more. Then he stilled, breathing, barely, and he looked up at her, eyes burning red, and full of something that wasn't him anymore. Chima's mind was not his own. It burned. Flashes of things he could not stop, could not look away from. His father, kneeling before something vast and dark. The edges of it were blurred, but the eyes, molten iron. And the mouth, too wide, too many teeth. Blood ran down the stone beneath him, from his hands, from his chest, from Chima's own wrists. Tiny, childlike, offered without question. A voice whispered to him. Close, too close. "You are mine," it said. Soft, loving, final. A mouthful of teeth pressed to his forehead. A kiss, sealing something that had been agreed upon long before he was born. Chima screamed, but it was silent. Inside his head. Forever. And when he came back to himself, what was left of himself, he was no longer kneeling, he was standing. Chima stood still, too still. His chest rose and fell with slow, deep breaths, each one louder than it should have been, like air rasping through something torn and wrong. His hands hung at his sides, claws glinting faintly in what little light remained. Adanna took a step back. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could hear Mama Inki chanting again behind her, words thick with desperation. But they were not enough. Nothing was. Chima's head tilted to one side, a slow, unnatural motion. When he spoke, his voice came from deep inside him, and something else spoke with him. "I was never meant to survive." His eyes flickered toward Adanna, then to Mama Inki, then back to the darkness of the gate behind them. "I was meant to return." His hands curled, flexing, testing the weight of the new strength in his body. "I'm not a man." A breath, a shudder that ran through him like a ripple over water. I'm a vessel. And he smiled. A terrible, broken thing, like something learning how to use muscles it had just stolen. The air changed. A pressure, sudden and sharp, crushed down on them, like the moment before lightning strikes, when the world holds its breath. Then, a blur of movement. Too fast. Chima lunged. Emeka didn't have time to raise his spear. He barely had time to turn his head. There was a sound. Not a scream. Not at first. The wet, sharp crunch of teeth breaking skin. Then Emeka shouted. A raw, ragged sound that tore free from his throat and echoed into the hollow space around them. Chima's mouth was at his shoulder, jaws locked deep. Blood sprayed, hot and dark, spattering across the ground in thick droplets. For a moment, Emeka struggled. His hands beat against Chima's chest, futile, desperate. Then, Chima released him. Emeka crumpled to the dirt, clutching his shoulder. His fingers slick and red, slipping over the wound where twin punctures bled freely. Chima stood over him, his mouth red with blood, his teeth sharp and slick. But his eyes, they wept. 2 thin lines of black tears ran down his face. Adanna couldn't move. Her legs felt carved from stone. Mama Inki hissed between her teeth. A vessel, she said. But it wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. The kind that comes when you realize you were too late, and always had been. The sky above the Gate of Whispers was no longer a sky, just black, heavy, pressing down as if it might collapse and bury them all beneath its weight. Adanna stood frozen, her breath shallow, catching in her throat like splinters. Beside her, Mama Inki's grip had loosened, but her hand still rested heavy on Adanna's arm. Chima did not move, not toward them, not away. His body stood still, but the thing behind his eyes was moving, awake, hungry. Emeka was on his knees, his breathing shallow now, slowing, then stopping. And yet, he did not fall. His head lifted slowly, like a puppet's jerked on old strings. His eyes were black voids. His mouth split in a slow, ragged smile that showed too many teeth. Adanna took a step back. Mama Inki did not. They had come, Mama Inki whispered, more to herself than anyone else, to close the gate. But the gate had opened wider, and it was not closing now. Chima turned to look at Adanna. His eyes gleamed red for a moment, as if catching light from a fire that wasn't there. I'm not the key, he said. His voice was both his and not. I'm the door. Behind them, the forest exhaled, a long, slow breath that shivered through the trees, down their trunks, into the earth beneath their feet. And with it came the first sound of many to follow. Footsteps. Dozens. Hundreds. Soft at first, but growing louder. The dead were rising, and they were singing his name. Coming next, Episode 4, The Serpent's Promise. Every promise made by a serpent comes wrapped in venom, but some promises are kept.